He didn't just file for divorce. He turned it into a performance. The courtroom lights were too bright for a Tuesday morning, casting a sterile glow over polished wood and pressed suits, but Ryan Foster looked perfectly at ease, leaning back in his chair like a man attending a show he had already paid to win, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as if keeping rhythm with the quiet murmurs filling the room. And when Charlotte Hayes stepped in, no one turned with recognition. Not the way people usually did when someone important entered, because to them she was just another woman about to lose everything, dressed simply in a tailored cream coat that whispered restraint rather than wealth, her heels making soft, measured clicks across the marble floor, each step unhurried, controlled, as if she had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove, while Ryan's lawyer smirked openly, shuffling papers with a kind of casual arrogance that suggested the outcome had been decided long before the judge would speak, and Ryan himself didn't bother to stand fully when she approached, offering only a glance, quick, dismissive, almost amused, before leaning toward his attorney and muttering something that drew a quiet chuckle, the kind that carried just far enough to sting without being obvious, and Charlotte noticed it. Of course she did, but her expression didn't fracture, didn't tighten, didn't betray even the smallest crack of reaction. She simply took her seat, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and looked forward, as if the entire room were nothing more than background noise, as if the man who once knew the rhythm of her breathing had become just another stranger passing through her day, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit, though he masked it quickly, straightening his tie and raising his voice just enough when the proceedings began, projecting confidence, ownership, control. "Your Honor," he said, with a tone polished for effect, "this is a straightforward case." And he glanced sideways at Charlotte with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There are no shared assets worth noting." The words landed like a verdict before any ruling had been made, and a few people in the back exchanged knowing looks, already filing her into a familiar category, another ex-wife who would walk away with nothing but regret. But Charlotte didn't look at them, didn't look at him. Her gaze remained steady, fixed somewhere ahead where no one else seemed to be looking, as if she were watching a different version of the room entirely, one that hadn't revealed itself yet. And Ryan mistook that stillness for weakness, for resignation, for the quiet collapse he had expected. He leaned back again, more relaxed now, crossing one leg over the other, his confidence growing louder with every second she refused to speak. And when his lawyer continued, outlining the narrative he had carefully constructed, how Ryan had built everything from the ground up, how Charlotte had contributed nothing of measurable value, the words flowed smoothly, rehearsed and sharpened, designed to leave no room for contradiction, and still, she said nothing, not when they minimized her presence, not when they erased her history, not even when Ryan let out a soft, incredulous laugh under his breath, the sound brief but unmistakable, like a final punctuation mark on his version of their story. And for a moment, it seemed as though the entire room had already decided who she was and who she wasn't. But what none of them could see, what Ryan had never bothered to understand, was that Charlotte Hayes had never needed to be loud to be powerful, because some truths didn't arrive with noise. They waited, patient and precise, for the exact moment when silence became impossible to ignore. No one in the courtroom remembered when Charlotte Hayes had ever spoken loudly, and that was exactly why they believed she had nothing worth hearing, because in a world that measured power by volume, silence was often mistaken for absence, and Ryan Foster had built his confidence on that mistake, leaning forward now with a relaxed certainty as his lawyer continued to shape the narrative, painting Charlotte as a quiet footnote in a story he claimed as entirely his own. But there had been a time when the silence between them had meant something different, when it carried understanding instead of dismissal. Long nights in a one-bedroom apartment just outside downtown Chicago, where the hum of traffic slipped through thin windows and mixed with the soft glow of a laptop screen, Charlotte sitting cross-legged on the couch, reviewing documents line by line while Ryan paced nearby, talking about ambition, about growth, about how one day everything would change, and she had listened then, not because she lacked her own voice, but because she had already begun building something he did not yet know how to see, something that did not need his approval to exist, and while he chased visibility, she chose structure. While he spoke in promises, she moved in quiet decisions, signing agreements under a different name, establishing accounts that did not trace back to the life he believed they shared, not out of secrecy born from fear, but from a clarity he never recognized, that not everything valuable needed to be displayed to be real, and over time the gap between what he showed the world and what she quietly constructed widened, though from the outside it looked like nothing at all, just a supportive wife standing beside a rising man, until one day even that illusion became unnecessary to him, until her presence felt smaller in his narrative than the image he wanted to project, and so he began to erase her. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in subtle ways, introductions that skipped her name, decisions made without her input, conversations that assumed her agreement. Without asking, and Charlotte noticed each one. Not with anger, but with a kind of calm awareness that settled deeper than disappointment, because she understood something he did not, that being unseen did not mean being unprepared, and now, sitting across from him in a courtroom where he believed he held every advantage, that same quiet composure remained intact, her hands still resting gently together, her breathing steady, as if the past and present were aligned in a way only she could understand. And when the judge glanced in her direction, perhaps expecting a reaction, a correction, anything that would disrupt the version of events being presented, Charlotte simply met her gaze for a brief moment, not pleading, not defensive, just present, as if she had already accepted that this part of the story needed to unfold exactly as it was. And Ryan mistook that again, mistook it for surrender, for the absence of strategy, unaware that every assumption he made was another step deeper into a situation he did not control. Because the truth about Charlotte Hayes had never been something you could hear in a room like this. It was something you discovered only when it was too late to change what you thought you knew. The pen slid across the paper with a soft, deliberate scratch, the sound barely noticeable in the quiet courtroom, yet somehow louder than anything Ryan Foster had said that morning, because signatures had a way of finalizing things people did not fully understand, and as he signed his name with a confident flourish, he did not look at Charlotte, did not hesitate, did not question a single line of the document placed in front of him, his focus fixed instead on the sense of closure he believed he was securing, the kind that came with walking away clean, untouched, and undeniably ahead. And when he leaned back after finishing, there was a subtle satisfaction in the way his shoulders relaxed, as if a weight he never acknowledged had just been removed, while his lawyer gathered the pages with a small nod of approval, everything proceeding exactly as expected, predictable, controlled, contained. But Charlotte watched that moment differently, her gaze steady on the ink that had not yet dried. Understanding something he did not, that the act of signing was not an ending but a confirmation, not of his victory, but of the assumptions he had chosen not to question, and for a brief second, her fingers shifted slightly in her lap, not nervously, not uncertain, just a small adjustment as if aligning herself with a timing only she could feel, and across the room, a clerk stepped forward to organize the documents, flipping through each page with routine efficiency, unaware of the quiet imbalance embedded within the details because everything appeared ordinary, the language standard, the structure familiar, the kind of legal agreement seen hundreds of times in rooms like this. And that was precisely why no one looked closer, why no one paused, why Ryan did not think twice about what he had just agreed to, because the most effective structures were the ones that blended seamlessly into expectation, and Charlotte had always understood that, had always known that visibility was not the same as value, and as the judge reviewed the paperwork, her expression remained neutral, professional, but there was a slight pause, almost imperceptible, as her eyes moved across a particular section, something subtle, something easily overlooked unless you knew where to look, and Charlotte noticed that pause, not with anticipation, but with recognition, as if watching a sequence unfold exactly as it was meant to, while Ryan remained unaware, shifting in his seat with a faint impatience, glancing briefly at his watch, already mentally stepping into the next version of his life, where this chapter no longer existed, where Charlotte Hayes was simply a closed file, a resolved inconvenience, and when he finally looked at her again, it was not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with a quiet dismissal that had become second nature, a belief so ingrained he no longer questioned its accuracy, and Charlotte met that look without resistance, without reaction, her expression unchanged, because there was nothing left for her to prove in that exchange, nothing left to correct. The truth did not require his acknowledgement to exist, and as the room settled into a brief stillness, the kind that comes just before something shifts, Charlotte allowed herself the smallest breath, not relief, not tension, just a steady inhale that marked the transition between what had been assumed and what was about to be revealed, because in that moment, while everyone else believed the story had already reached its conclusion, Charlotte Hayes knew with absolute clarity that it had only just begun. There was a version of Charlotte Hayes that no one in that courtroom had ever met, a version that did not sit quietly with folded hands or lower her gaze when others spoke over her. But that version had never needed an audience to exist. It had been built in early mornings before. The city fully woke, in quiet offices that smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood, where sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows and painted long lines across a desk that was never cluttered, only precise, only intentional, and in those spaces, she was not invisible. She was addressed directly, listened to carefully, her voice calm but decisive as she reviewed numbers that stretched far beyond what anyone in that courtroom would have imagined, figures that moved across screens in clean columns, investments layered across industries, technology, real estate, logistics, each one structured through entities that did not carry her public name but were tied unmistakably to her decisions, her strategy, her timing. And while Ryan had spent years building something that needed to be seen to feel real, Charlotte had constructed something that did not depend on recognition to hold its value. She remembered the first time she chose that path, sitting across from a senior advisor in a quiet conference room, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass like a promise she did not need to chase, only to understand. And when he asked her why she preferred to remain unlisted, to operate through layers that concealed her identity, she had simply said, because visibility invites assumption, and she had already seen what assumptions could cost. Already understood that the more people believed they knew about you, the less they questioned what they could not see. And that principle became the foundation of everything she built, each decision reinforcing a structure that appeared ordinary on the surface, while holding something far more substantial beneath. And over time, her world expanded without noise, partnerships formed without announcements, acquisitions finalized without headlines, and yet every move was deliberate, every detail accounted for. A quiet architecture of power that did not need to declare itself to be effective, and now, sitting in a courtroom where her entire existence was being reduced to nothing more than an absence of contribution, Charlotte felt none of the urgency that filled the room, because she was not reacting to the moment, she was observing it, the way one watches a scene they have already studied from every angle, and when the judge adjusted the documents again, her fingers pausing just slightly over a page that held more weight than its simple formatting suggested, Charlotte recognized the shift not as a surprise, but as a continuation, the natural progression of something set in motion long before Ryan had decided to turn their separation into a display, and across from her, he shifted again, his confidence still intact, still anchored in the belief that everything of value had already been accounted for, that what remained was merely formality. But Charlotte knew better, because the life she had built did not exist in the places he had looked. It did not answer to the name he had dismissed, and as the quiet in the room stretched just a fraction longer than expected, subtle but unmistakable, it carried with it the first indication that what had been overlooked was not missing at all. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to be seen. The name had not been spoken in that room yet, and that was precisely why its absence carried weight, because some names did not need introduction until the exact moment they changed everything, and Charlotte Hayes had learned long ago that timing was not about speed, it was about precision, about knowing when silence created more impact than explanation. And as the judge continued reviewing the documents, her posture shifting ever so slightly as she reached a section that required closer attention, Charlotte remained still, her gaze steady, her presence composed in a way that did not seek validation, while across from her Ryan Foster exhaled quietly, the faintest trace of impatience slipping through his otherwise confident demeanor, his fingers tapping once against the table before stopping, as if reminding himself that this was already finished, that whatever remained was procedural, insignificant. And when his lawyer leaned in to whisper something brief, Ryan nodded with a small, satisfied smile, the kind that comes from believing the outcome has already been secured. But what he did not notice, what no one in the room had yet fully registered, was the shift happening just beneath the surface of the proceedings, subtle but unmistakable to those who understood what to look for, and Charlotte had seen it the moment the judge's eyes paused not once but twice on the same line, a detail easily dismissed by anyone expecting simplicity, but not by someone trained to recognize structure, and in that quiet recognition, Charlotte's fingers moved again, not nervously, not uncertain, but with the smallest adjustment, as if aligning with a rhythm that had finally reached its cue, and for a brief second, her attention drifted, not away from the room, but beyond it, to a memory that did not carry emotion so much as clarity, a private office overlooking the Hudson River, the soft hum of the city below muted by thick glass, where a man had once stood beside her rather than across from her, his presence calm, his voice measured, never loud, never demanding, and when he spoke her name, he had not shortened it, had not altered it to fit convenience. He had said it fully, Charlotte Hayes, as if acknowledging something others overlooked, and when she had corrected him quietly, explaining that the name he saw was not the one that mattered, he had only nodded once, understanding without question, and from that moment forward, he had addressed her differently, not by the name the world recognized, but by the one tied to everything she had built beyond its view. And that distinction had never needed explanation, never needed announcement. It simply existed between them as fact, as alignment, as something steady in a world that often relied on perception. And now, as Charlotte returned her focus to the courtroom, that same steadiness remained, untouched by the assumptions surrounding her, because the truth did not require urgency to be real. It required only the right moment to be seen, and when the judge finally lifted her gaze, her expression no longer entirely neutral, carrying a hint of curiosity sharpened by recognition, the room shifted in a way that could not yet be explained but could be felt, like the air just before a storm that had not yet broken, and Ryan noticed it then, not fully, not clearly, but enough to pause. Enough to glance toward Charlotte again with something that was no longer pure dismissal, something closer to uncertainty, though he quickly masked it, straightening slightly, as if posture alone could restore the control he believed he still held, unaware that control had never belonged to him in the way he imagined, because Charlotte Hayes had never needed to correct him, she had only needed to wait, and now, that wait was beginning to reach its end. The room did not change all at once. There was no sudden noise, no raised voices, no dramatic interruption, only a shift so subtle it could have been mistaken for routine if not for the way it altered the rhythm of everything that followed, because when the judge placed the document down instead of turning the page, when her fingers rested there a second longer than necessary, the air itself seemed to pause with her, and Charlotte Hayes recognized that pause with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning, not as a surprise but as confirmation, while across the table Ryan Foster leaned forward slightly, the movement almost instinctive, as if trying to anticipate what he could not yet see, his earlier ease replaced by a faint tension he did not fully understand, and when the judge finally spoke, her tone remained measured, professional. But there was a difference now, a precision that drew the attention of everyone in the room without needing to demand it. "Mr. Foster," she said, her eyes briefly lifting toward him before returning to the document. "Before we proceed, there are disclosures here that require clarification," and the words were simple, procedural even, but they landed differently than anything that had been said before, because they introduced something that had not been part of his expectation, and Ryan straightened, his expression tightening just enough to suggest that the certainty he had relied on was no longer entirely stable, while his lawyer quickly adjusted beside him, leaning in to review the page the judge indicated, flipping through the document with a speed that suggested confidence, but carried the first hint of urgency beneath it, and Charlotte remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting exactly where they had been, because for her this moment was not disruption, it was alignment, the natural point where what had been overlooked began to surface, and as the quiet stretched, the judge continued, her voice steady. These filings indicate that certain assets have not been fully addressed in the current agreement, and this time the room reacted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a collective shift of attention that moved like a ripple through the rows of observers. Subtle glances exchanged, a slight straightening of posture, the kind of reaction that comes when something unexpected begins to take shape, and Ryan felt it, even if he could not yet define it, his gaze moving quickly from the judge to his lawyer, and then, almost unwillingly, to Charlotte, searching for something in her expression that might explain what was happening, but she offered him nothing, no reaction, no correction, only the same composed stillness that had frustrated him from the start, and in that stillness there was something else now, something he had not seen before, not because it had changed, but because he had never looked closely enough to recognize it, and his lawyer spoke then, quickly, attempting to regain control of the narrative, explaining that all relevant assets had been disclosed, that the agreement reflected a complete and accurate representation. His tone confident but edged with a subtle strain, as if the certainty required to support his words was beginning to slip, and the judge listened without interruption, her gaze steady, before returning once more to the document, her finger tracing a line with deliberate care, and when she spoke again, it was with a clarity that left no room for assumption. "Then perhaps you can explain," she said, "why these holdings are listed under a name that does not appear anywhere in your submitted disclosures." And the question did not raise her voice, did not accuse, but it shifted the entire foundation of the room in a way that could no longer be ignored, because for the first time since the proceedings had begun, the narrative Ryan had relied on was no longer the only one present, and as the silence that followed settled deeper than before, heavier, more defined, Charlotte Hayes did not move, did not speak, because she had never needed to interrupt a story that was already beginning to unravel on its own. The silence that followed the judge's question did not feel empty, it felt precise, as if every second was being measured against something no one in the room could yet see clearly, and Ryan Foster was the first to break under it, not outwardly, not in any way that would appear obvious, but in the small shift of his posture, the way his shoulders no longer rested as easily against the back of his chair, the way his gaze moved too quickly between the judge and his lawyer, searching for reassurance that did not arrive as quickly as he expected, and when his attorney finally spoke, his voice remained controlled, professional, but there was a slight hesitation at the beginning, a fraction of a second that had not been there before. "Your Honor, there may be a clerical misunderstanding," he said, reaching for the document with a confidence that now felt practiced rather than natural, flipping through the pages again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if the answers might appear if he examined the text closely enough, and the judge allowed him that moment without interruption, her attention steady, patient, but unyielding, while the rest of the room leaned into the quiet in ways they did not fully realize, every movement more restrained, every breath more noticeable, because something had shifted beyond routine, something that could not be easily explained away. And Charlotte Hayes remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, her presence unchanged, her expression composed, not detached but certain, as if she had already stepped beyond the need for this moment to confirm anything for her, and when Ryan finally looked at her again, it was no longer with dismissal, it was with a question he had not yet formed into words, something unfamiliar, something that unsettled the version of events he had carried with such confidence. And Charlotte met that look without offering resolution, because resolution was not something she needed to provide. It was something he would have to arrive at on his own, and the judge spoke again, her tone still even, but now carrying a clarity that anchored the room in place. "The name attached to these holdings," she said, her eyes lifting briefly before returning to the page, "does not match either party listed in this proceeding," and she paused, not for effect, but because the detail itself required acknowledgement. And Ryan's lawyer responded more quickly this time, attempting to regain control, suggesting that the name in question might belong to an unrelated entity, that it did not affect the current case. But even as he spoke, There was a subtle strain beneath his words, a recognition that the explanation did not fully align with what was being presented, and the judge listened, her expression unchanged, before asking a simple question. "Then why," she said, "are these assets directly linked to financial activity originating from accounts associated with Mrs. Hayes?" And this time the reaction was not subtle, not contained. The room did not erupt, but it tightened, every person present aware that something had crossed from uncertainty into contradiction, and Ryan felt it completely now. The shift no longer abstract, no longer distant, his gaze snapping back to Charlotte with a clarity that had been absent before, as if seeing her for the first time in a way he could not easily reconcile with the narrative he had constructed. And Charlotte did not look away, did not lower her eyes. She simply held that moment with the same quiet steadiness she had carried all along, because this was not where her story changed, this was where his understanding of it began to. The moment did not arrive with a raised voice or a sudden declaration. It unfolded with a quiet inevitability that made it impossible to interrupt, because once the question had been asked, the answer was already moving into place, and the judge did not rush, did not press. She simply turned another page, her attention focused, her voice steady as she began to read aloud details that until now had existed only in numbers and filings. "The assets in question are held under the name Charlotte Vaughn," she said, each word clear, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and for a fraction of a second the names seemed to hover in the air without meaning, disconnected from the room, from the case, from everything Ryan Foster believed he understood. And then the connection formed, not all at once, but in a sequence of realizations that tightened his expression, that stilled his movements, that forced his attention fully toward the woman sitting across from him, because Charlotte Hayes had not reacted, had not shifted, had not corrected the name, and that absence of reaction carried more weight than any explanation could have. And the judge continued, her tone unchanged. "These holdings include controlling interests in multiple registered entities, collectively valued in excess of $180 million, and this time the room did not remain composed. The shift was unmistakable, a quiet intake of breath, the subtle sound of papers being adjusted. The kind of reaction that could not be contained because it was no longer about procedure, it was about revelation, and Ryan felt it fully now. The certainty he had relied on dissolving into something far less stable, his mind attempting to reconcile the information with the version of Charlotte he had constructed, the version he had dismissed, minimized, erased, and finding no alignment between the two, while his lawyer spoke again, quickly, attempting to reframe the situation, to suggest that the name might be coincidental, that further verification would be required. But even his voice carried less conviction than before, because the structure of the information did not support doubt, it supported clarity, and the judge acknowledged the statement with a slight nod before continuing. "The documentation further indicates that Charlotte Vaughn is the principal beneficiary and authorized signatory on all associated accounts," and this time she lifted her gaze directly to Charlotte, not questioning, not uncertain, but recognizing, and Charlotte met that gaze with the same calm composure she had carried from the beginning, because nothing being said was new to her, nothing required adjustment or defense. It simply existed, fully, undeniably, and in that moment the distance between what Ryan believed and what was real became impossible to ignore, because the woman he thought he understood was now defined by something he had never considered, something he had never asked about, and something he could no longer dismiss. And when he finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of the casual confidence he had carried into the room, "That is not her name," he said. The words less a statement than an attempt to hold onto something familiar, and Charlotte did not interrupt, did not correct him immediately. She allowed the silence that followed to settle, to expand, to make space for the truth to exist without resistance, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, almost quiet, but it carried through the room with a clarity that did not need volume. "It is," she said, and nothing more. No explanation, no elaboration, because none was necessary. The document spoke, the structure spoke, the reality spoke, and for the first time since the proceedings had begun, Charlotte Hayes was no longer invisible in that room. not because she had raised her voice, but because the truth had finally been given a name that could not be ignored. The room did not return to what it had been before, because once the truth had been spoken, it did not leave quietly. It remained, settling into every corner of the space, reshaping the way each person saw what had already happened, and Ryan Foster felt that shift more than anyone, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual unraveling of everything he had believed was certain. His posture no longer relaxed, his gaze no longer steady, as if the ground beneath him had not disappeared but had changed in a way he could no longer navigate with confidence. And across from him Charlotte sat exactly as she had from the beginning, composed, still, untouched by the tension that now filled the room, because nothing about this moment was new to her. It was simply the first time it had been allowed to exist in the open, and the judge continued, her voice measured, moving through the remaining details with clarity that left no space for interpretation, confirming the extent of the holdings, the structure of ownership, the legal standing that placed Charlotte not as a dependent party in the case, but as an individual whose financial position existed entirely outside the assumptions that had framed the proceedings. And with each word, the imbalance that had once favored Ryan shifted further, not dramatically, not loudly, but definitively, until it became impossible to pretend it had ever been otherwise. And his lawyer, who had entered the room with confidence, now sat in a silence that suggested calculation rather than control, understanding that the narrative they had constructed no longer held, that the foundation it relied on had been replaced by something they had not accounted for. And Ryan looked at Charlotte again, but this time there was no dismissal, no quiet amusement, only a searching recognition that arrived too late to change anything, because the person he thought he had understood was now revealed in a way that made his previous certainty seem distant, almost irrelevant. And Charlotte did not meet that look with triumph, did not allow any visible reaction to surface, because this was not a victory she needed to display. It was a truth she had never lost. And when the judge finally concluded, outlining the implications with a calm finality that brought the proceedings to their natural end, the room remained quiet for a moment longer than expected, as if everyone present needed a second to adjust to the reality that had replaced the one they assumed. And Charlotte rose then. Not quickly, not slowly, simply with intention, her movements as composed as they had been when she first entered, and she did not look back at Ryan, did not pause for acknowledgement, because there was nothing left in that direction that required her attention. And as she walked toward the exit, the soft sound of her heels against the floor echoed faintly in the quiet, steady, unhurried. And just before she reached the doors, they opened without her needing to touch them, revealing a figure waiting on the other side, his presence calm, his posture relaxed. And when Charlotte stepped through, he did not speak immediately. He simply offered his hand, not as a gesture of rescue, but of recognition, and she accepted it with the same quiet certainty she had carried throughout. And together they moved forward without looking back, leaving behind a room that was still adjusting to what it had witnessed, because Charlotte Hayes had not returned to prove anyone wrong. She had simply allowed the truth to be seen, and in doing so, she had not taken anything from Ryan. She had only revealed what had never belonged to him in the first place. And as the doors closed softly behind her, the silence that remained was no longer empty, it was complete.